Dear speakers and dear audience, dear all, welcome back to our symposium, Future Bodies from a Recent Past, Sculpture, Technology and the Body since the 1950s. My name is Franziska Lienhardt and I'm Research Associate at Museum Brandhorst in Munich, and I'm organizing the symposium together with my great colleague Patricia Danda. Our symposium takes place in the run-up to an exhibition of the same title, which will open in Museum Brandhorst in early summer 2022. And tonight's panel, with the title Posthuman, Embodiment and Material Entanglements, a Theoretical Outlook and Review, is the closing event of our 3-day symposium. And our project's narrative of sculpture as a hybrid concept and form, hovering between technology and figuration of the body, is interesting not merely from an art historical perspective. Sculpture's history is influenced and permitted by questions that are just as much concerned with the history of media theory, philosophy, sociology, or literature, and many more. For this reason, approaching a contemporary theory of sculpture from interdisciplinary perspectives seems not only incredibly important, but indispensable. Digital technologies have become more and more woven into the fabric of our everyday life. They also seem to determine our togetherness and our bodies as we experience it, especially in these recent times of the pandemic. But while we are all adapting to the current situation, what better occasion would there be for this kind of disembodied gathering? And this is why I'm thrilled and super honored that great thinkers are joining us for this panel, namely Anne Catherine Hales from Durham in North Carolina and Josef Bala from Frankfurt am Main, who both share their promising contributions with us today. The panel will be moderated by brilliant Maria Müller, who is Professor of Philosophy and Aesthetics Theory at the Academy of Fine Arts here in Munich. And now to posthuman, embodiment, and material entanglements. In recent series, the body is described as a permeable, open system that is in mutual exchange with its environment. Biological, technological, and sociocultural influences shape and alter the body and vice versa. This panel will address approaches such as that of posthumanism and new materialism and the suspension of the ontological difference between humans and their environment. A neat division between human and non-human actors and agency becomes increasingly complex. In this panel, theoretical approaches, critical histories, and practical examples, such as the development of robot dogs, will be used to show how supposedly invisible technologies have always been embodied and dependent on their environment. Up for discussion here are then also the difficult economic and biopolitical mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion. And I think we heard that before in Louis Trudeau-Zucchi's fantastic intermezzo today. After all, what does it actually still mean to be human or posthuman? And what does it mean to not to be human or posthuman? As one agent among many, how does one navigate in this environment, this time, and in these determinative capitalist structures? And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about these issues in the next 2 hours. And maybe a short information in advance regarding the schedule of today's panel. The 2 presentations will last about 20 minutes each, and after that, Maria Müller will launch into a conversation with the speakers and then invite the other symposium participants virtually to ask questions and discuss them with us. And questions via the chat of YouTube are always welcome, so they will be included in the last part of our panel. And now, please allow me to introduce Maria Müller, who will generously moderate this following panel. Maria Müller is Professor of Philosophy and Aesthetic Theory at the Academy of Fine Arts here in Munich, as I already said before. In 2007, she was awarded her doctorate for her thesis on genealogy of biopolitics, the concept of life in Foucault and Canguilhem. From 2014 to 2020, she was sub-project leader in the DFG research unit Media and Mimesis. And she's a member of the advisory board of the German Society for Aesthetics, a PI at the international doctoral program Mimesis at LMU Munich. In 2018, she was a fellow at the research group Build Evidence at the FU in Berlin, where she researched on mimetic milieus, a techno-aesthetic approach. She is co-founder and publisher of August Verlag in Berlin. And since spring 2020, Maria Muhle is member of the DFG Research Training Group Media Anthropology at Bauhaus University in Weimar, with whom we are planning a workshop in the course of our project on future bodies from a recent past, and whose members may be part of our virtual audience right now. So welcome to you. Maria Muhle published widely on political aesthetics, media philosophy, mimesis, strategies of reenactment, and biopolitics. And among her recent publications, and that are all my translations, are Black Box Live, co-edited with Christiane Voss, Mimesis and Aesthesis, Realism and History in Auerbach and Rancière, or Practices of Incarnation, Reenacting, Embodying, and Incarnating. And Maria is currently working on a project on Qualoir and his milieu. And this is why I'm even more delighted that Maria Muhle is moderating this panel. So please welcome Maria. I wish you an interesting discussion on posthuman embodiment and material entanglements.
Thank you very much, Franziska, for your very, very generous introduction. I'm extremely happy to chair this final panel of your extraordinary conference. And I would like to thank you and Patricia and the Museum Brandhorst for the invitation to be here. And without further ado, I'm very honored to introduce Catherine Hayes as our first speaker tonight. Catherine Hayes is a distinguished research professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the James B. Duke Professor of Literature Emerita from Duke University in Durham, as Franzi has already pointed out. She was trained both in chemistry and in English literature, and her work has the rare quality of relentlessly navigating between these fields of science and literature. She has been recognized by many fellowships and awards, including 2 honorary degrees, and she is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Excuse me. She has published extensively, and I would like to quote only a few of her very influential books and articles. Her first book, The Cosmic Web, Scientific Field Models and Literary Strategies, published in 1984 with Cornell University Press, accounts for the fascinating convergences and uncanny similarities between current literary theory and the contemporary scientific models. A fascination that is still at the heart of her research. In an interview from 2009, she states, and I quote, "My idea from the beginning was that both fields were reacting to larger cultural concerns. And therefore, it is crucial to develop a methodology that, and I quote again, not only can account for the parallels, but equally important, the very significant differences that emerge in a field like literary studies versus some scientific field, let us say, cybernetics." As it happens, this interview was published on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of her seminal book, How We Became Posthuman, Virtual Bodies in Cybernetics, Literature and Informatics, published in 1999 with University of Chicago Press. I think it is safe to say that this book was and still is the main reference in the ongoing discussions about the posthuman, and has certainly been a very important reference for putting this panel together. More recently, she has focused her work on digital media and the so-called digital humanities, and in How We Think, Digital Media and Contemporary Technogenesis, University of Chicago Press 2015, she argues for such a technogenesis, which is the belief that humans and techniques are co-evolving. In Unthought, The Power of the Cognitive Non-Conscious, published in 2017, Hayes breaks with anthropocentric views of cognition with a framework that enmeshes biological and technical cognition, and comes back again to the significance of human or post-human embodiment in the face of technological forces. And last but not least, she is currently at work on Technosymbiosis, Futures of the Human, where I can only assume she will discuss the dimensions of the human-machine interactions in light of new developments in digital and environmental media. Let me stop here. I could go on for at least an hour, I think, but we want to hear you. So I'm very happy to finally hand over the microphone to Catherine Hayes for her talk entitled Artificial Bodies in Motion, from Top-Down Control to Relational Embeddedness. We are very much looking forward to hearing you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for that lovely introduction. And I would also like to thank the organizers for the conference for the invitation to be here and to welcome all the virtual participants as well. So today I'll be talking about robot bodies and tracing the evolutionary trajectory that they have undergone from top down to distributed architecture. Next slide. So I'll start with some general comparisons between biological life forms and computational media. Biological life forms, as we know, start from the mandate survive and reproduce. No biological life form is exempt from this mandate. Otherwise, they disappear from the record, which of course has happened for many species over the course of planetary life on Earth. And over eons, this mandate has now developed into the ability to think about design and purpose, most evident with the human species. But if we compare this evolutionary trajectory with computational media, we see that it has undergone an inversion, that instead of starting with survive and reproduce, computational media start with design and purpose, and then as they become increasingly flexible, resilient, and robust, work up to survival and perhaps even reproduction. Next slide. So the second great inversion happens in similar fashion. Biological life forms all start with immersion in their environment and develop the ability to deal with environmental fluctuations and variations and unpredictabilities. If they don't have this ability, they will become extinct. And then over eons work up to the ability to form abstractions, most evident in the human species. Again, for computational media, they go in the opposite direction. They start with symbolic abstraction through the logic gates that underlie all computers with von Neumann architecture, and then work up to the ability to immerse themselves in environments and deal with unpredictabilities and fluctuations. So we get at the get-go these two great inversions from survive and reproduce, design and purpose, inverted for computational media, and secondly, immersion to abstraction, inverted for computational media. Next slide. So these slides will make clear why artificial life researchers made a fundamental mistake that led to what's called the AI winter, 1974 to 1980. Because in human terms, abstraction was sort of the pinnacle of the evolutionary trajectory, they thought that they should start computational media with this kind of top-down abstraction. But what they failed to take into account is that the ability to abstract for biological life forms was already built on a very robust and resilient ability to deal with environmental fluctuations. So consequently, machines which were trying to navigate the environment, not using the kind of immersive skills that biological life forms use just routinely and instinctively, but rather they were trying to navigate environments using top-down abstraction. So the first robots were structured to create central representations of a room, for example. Then they would calculate the distances to wanted to go in the room. They'd send the command to actuators. They would move a few feet, they would stop, then they would have to recalculate. And Rodney Brooks, who I'll mention again very shortly, was babysitting a robot that his roommate at MIT, Hans Moravec, had developed, and the robot was taking 2 hours to cross the room. And if a cockroach went across the room in the meantime, it was hopelessly thrown off and had to start all over again. So Brooks, watching the robot, compared it to the cockroach and thought that the cockroach couldn't possibly have as much computational power on board as the robot, and yet it was able to do effortlessly in a fraction of time what the robot was trying to accomplish. Next slide. So this led Brooks to propose what turned out to be a real revolution in the design of AI robots, what he called subsumption architecture. So first of all, his argument was that to develop real-life capabilities, robots had to be embodied, that simulation was not enough. And he emphasized the ability to navigate in unpredictable real-life environments. And he abandoned entirely the idea of a central representation. Rather, he went to a distributed architecture that gave the properties of resilience and robustness much more force than in the previous designs. Next slide. So this is an example of subsumption architecture, and we see that it's structured in layers. So in this example, the overarching command would be explore world, but on a separate layer, there would be another level of actuators with the command wander around, and on still another separate layer, an actuator command avoid objects. But nevertheless, this subsumption architecture worked quite well to yield robots that could actually navigate real-life environments. Next slide. And Brooks emphasized that sometimes it was possible to get what he called cheap tricks, that is, unexpected emergent effects between layers where you got essentially complexity for free. And so the robot had no central representation. It had no module corresponding to consciousness in a human, but nevertheless, it was capable of performing fairly complex activities. And Brooks emphasized that when someone looking at the robot from the outside saw intelligence, this intelligence was in the eye of the beholder. It was not in the robot itself. So when I visited Rodney Brooks at his lab around 1990, I was met by a welcoming robot that showed me around the lab. And at one point in the robot's progression, it turned to me and said, "I have no idea what I'm saying." And of course, this was pre-programmed, but to emphasize the idea that the impression of intelligence that the robot gave was purely my anthropomorphic projection onto it, not anything that it had in its slide. Next. So critics of subsumption architecture pointed out that this mode of real-life navigation had as its big advantage that the robot could move in unpredictable environments, but it was not suited to language acquisition. Nevertheless, there has been some recent work by Luke Steels developing robots who develop their own unique language by interacting with each other through embodied activities. And you can find that on the web if you do a search for Luke Steels and the BBC interview, lovely interview where you see these two robots begin to develop a proto-language among themselves. Next slide. So here we have the state of the art in the mid to late 1980s. And we're going to play this very short video on a loop, and I'll talk about it as it goes on. Video, please. So this is a quadruped developed in the MIT Leg Lab. And you can see that it's moving in a straight line around a corridor that has no obstacles in it, and it's tethered to its human partner with a rope through which commands can be conveyed. So this is a fairly inflexible object. It's capable of motion, it's capable of sustaining itself in an upright position, but only if it meets no obstacles and nothing unexpected happens. So that's where the art was in 1987. Next slide. And here we have Boston Dynamics quadruped robot in 2020, and you'll see the amazing difference between this robot and the one that we just saw. And they've called this Spot. It's sort of dog-like, so they gave it a dog-like name. Video, please. So you can see what enormous strides have been made in robot technology from the late 1980s to the present. Next slide, please. And here we have another example from Boston Dynamics of the box stacking robot. And I'd like to compare and contrast this with Spot. So can we have the video, please? You'll see that the robot, rather than having the quadruped structure, here has wheels instead. And it's meant to work in a warehouse and to stack boxes. So here we see it place precisely boxes on a pallet. This is one of its earlier instantiations that I'll have more to say about in a moment. But going back to the box stacking robot, you can see two of them working here. One is placing the boxes on a conveyor belt, the other is loading them. And to appreciate how complex this is, you have to realize the kind of vision capabilities that are required in order to get these boxes stacked exactly right. And at the end of the robot is like a suction cup capable of grasping boxes up to 30 pounds in weight. So another version of robot mobility. Next slide. If we think about these robots not as objects but as moving sculptures, we can see what kind of aesthetics underlie their design. First of all, form follows function. So you see the radical difference in form between the quadruped robot and the box stacking robot. You see an emphasis on robustness and resilience and the ability to work in controlled but not controlled environments, but environments that may also incorporate some degree of unpredictability. And the emphasis here again is on embodiment in three-dimensional space versus simulation. Next slide. So if we think about these two different robots, the Spot robot is designed to invite anthropomorphic projection. This is what Simone Natil in her forthcoming book calls deceitful media. And her point that what she calls banal deception is not incidental to the development of artificial intelligence, but actually intrinsic to it. And banal deception has a evolutionary purpose, and that is to design the artificial intelligent form in such a way that it invites projections from humans in order to facilitate a closer bond with humans. And we'll see the extent to which Boston Dynamics has gone to this in the next slide. So next slide. This is a video created by Boston Dynamics called Uptown Spot to give us the ultimate in projection for their quadruped robot Spot. Play the video, please. Okay, next slide. So especially with that little posterior wiggle there, you can see that they have adopted all these human dance moves, even the provocative derriere shot. And you also see how they are using the camera, which is functional in terms of the robot's vision system, as a kind of head and mouth. So at one point, the robot lifts its, quote, head, and you see it begin to mouth some of the words of the song. So if we look at now what's going on in terms of the evolutionary trajectory of these forms, we can return to the Handle robot, and we'll see a very clear trajectory here. It begins with a horse-like form. So you'll notice on the left there, despite the wheels, it now has what looks like 4 legs and something that could resemble a head. So it's a form that appeals to the anthropomorphic projection of a horse. If you look at the middle slide, now you see that they've entirely abandoned the head idea altogether, gone to a much more functional suction cup type device suited to lift boxes. And the lesson here that we see embodied before us is that when the robot is designed to operate in an environment without human beings, that is to say, in a warehouse, they're emphasizing function over form. They're doing away with several of the anthropomorphic allusions, and they're going to a form that's much more designed to accomplish a specific purpose. Next slide. So we see 2 evolutionary trajectories here. One is human-oriented, and I would say that Spot illustrates that, where the emphasis is on interactions with humans. The other is functionally oriented, with an emphasis on task performance. So 2 very different evolutionary trajectories, all happening in the last 2 decades. Next slide. Now this video represents, I think, the ultimate in an invitation of anthropomorphic projection. So this is their humanoid robot called Atlas. And watch what happens in this video. Video, please. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. So you see the two humanoid robots dancing, showing off their flexibility and ability to even jump around and kick up their leg and so forth. You see the Spot robot come on and begin to lip sync the words, or an imitation of lip syncing with "Do You Love Me?" And then because they just couldn't resist showing off all their work, you get the handle robot going across the scene somewhat incongruously, all to the tune of "Do You Love Me?", inviting their human viewers to empathize with them, to feel emotional affect toward them because of their flexibility and robustness and so forth. So a very amusing video out by Dynamics. Next slide. So what we have here is what I've called cognitive assemblages. That is humans as cognizers, also technical objects as cognizers, engaging in complex interactions with one another, which I can call technosymbiosis. So symbiosis, of course, is a term that biologists use. Species interact to the mutual benefit of both. Technosymbiosis implies an interaction between humans and technical artificial cognitive beings with multiple feedback loops between them that on an evolutionary scale amount to feedback loops between biological and technical evolution. Now, we're accustomed to thinking of human evolution and biological evolution as controlled by genetics, but in fact, the situation is much more complex than that. As Mark Baldwin pointed out toward the end of the 19th century, where he pointed out that when a species undergoes an adaptation, it changes the environment in such a way as to favor that adaptation. So you get continuing feedback loops between the environment and the species. And for humans, this also means neurological adaptation through a phenomenon called synaptogenesis, where the synaptic networks are winnowed through interactions with the environment. Those networks that are adaptive for that environment strengthen and grow. Those that are not fade away and die. And so at birth, every human person through synaptogenesis develops a synaptic network suited to its environment. So that means that a baby growing up in a tribal area in Africa would literally have a different brain configuration than a baby growing up, say, in Los Angeles through this mechanism of synaptogenesis. There's also now an equivalent adaptive mechanism for technological systems through something like recurrent neural nets, where by interacting with the environment, the neural net system learns to strengthen those connections that are adaptive in the environment and to decrease and to do away with the connections that are not adaptive for the environment. So this creates the possibility for not genetic adaptation, but neurological adaptation in conjunction with the environment. And both of these environments, that is for humans and for technical objects, are now in dynamic interaction with each other through this process that I call technosymbiosis, because symbiosis implies benign cooperation between two different species. This term is emphasizing the positive interactions, but as we know, there are also strong negative effects, summed up perhaps most succinctly in the phrase algorithmic governmentality, that leads to something like surveillance capitalism and so forth. But in this talk, I've emphasized the ability of robots to interact synergistically and cooperatively with humans. In fact, one of the panel organizers sent me a link to a recent story where Spot, the robot, is now being used to help herd sheep in Australia. I should add that the robot dog sells for about the same price as a prize biological dog. I have a friend who owns a dog that cost about $10,000. That's about what Spot sells for. So you have your choice. You could get a prize dog, or you could buy Spot, either one. Next slide, please. So what then can we say about the future of artificial bodies? During the time that Rodney Brooks was developing his argument about subsumption architecture, others like Marvin Minsky, for example, were emphasizing the importance of simulation. So embodiment benefits from simulated programs which can help determine in what direction design should move. Simulation also benefits from embodiment because it isn't until a creature is tried out in an unpredictable environment that you really see where its fragilities lie. So they're in dynamic interaction with each other, also occasion antagonism to one another for proponents who want to argue for one approach, the benefit of one approach over the other. In the same way, sensors are in dynamic interaction with database algorithms, which customarily do not require sensors. Those people who want to propose the importance of sensors emphasize how important sensors are for action in the embodiment. But sensors also depend on developments that can be highlighted through database algorithms, and database algorithms also benefit from the kind of feedback possible through sensors. Autonomous evolution, which is now evident in something like the humanoid robot from Boston Dynamics, is also in dynamic interchange with program development. In fact, each of those actions the robots performed in those videos had to be programmed, but programmed at a relatively high level where you could issue a program that says something like lift leg without having to worry about all the underlying balance requirements which are built into the robot through hardware and firmware. So yes, each of those motions are programmed, but the robot itself is determining how to find its balance for one leg in its environment, and among its environment are its other legs. So this is the distributed architecture approach at work. And then finally, biological evolution is in dynamic interaction with technological evolution for better and for worse. But I think this is a process which will only intensify in the coming years, and it's something that we need to think deeply and carefully about. Next slide. So that concludes my presentation. Thanks for your attention, and I'm very interested to hear now what Joseph will have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine Hales, for this. Oh, I'm sorry, for this fascinating and very rich and also funny talk and the videos. I'm sure there will be many questions and comments, and I'm eager to get into this discussion. But as Franziska has already announced, we will hear first the second talk, and we'll have a joint discussion afterwards. So thank you, Catherine, again, and see you in a bit. And now I'm very happy to introduce Josef Barler, our second speaker tonight. Josef Barler is a postdoctoral researcher in sociology based at Goethe-Universität Frankfurt, and more specifically within the research field of biotechnology, nature, and society. He earned his PhD from the University of Vienna and has been a visiting researcher at the Science and Justice Research Center of the University of California at Santa Cruz, as well as with the, and I quote, the Seed Box, a Mistra Formas Environmental Humanities Co-Laboratory, very intriguing name, based at Linköping University. In 2019, he has published his book, The Techno-Apparatus of Bodily Production, a new materialist theory of technology and the body, with Transkript Verlag. And in this book, he explores how expanding on the concept of the apparatus of bodily production in the work of Dana Haraway and Karen Barat Material bodies, along with their boundaries, properties, and meanings, performatively materialize at sites where technological, biological, technoscientific, biopolitical, and economic forces interact. He has published also several articles, among which I would like to quote only the following two: Technologies of failure, bodies of resistance, science, technology, and the mechanics of materializing market bodies, that was published in the volume Mattering, Feminism, Science, and Materialism, edited by Victoria Pitts Taylor for New York University Press in 2016, as well as Techno-Ecologies of Borders, Thinking with Borders as Multi-Species Matters of Care, together with Christoph Hubatschke, published in the Australian Feminist Studies in 2017. And he has also written several entries for the New Materialism Almanac, edited by Sam Skinner and David Gauthier. His research evolves in the field of feminist epistemologies, bio and necropolitics, and new materialist theories of technologies and bodies. And he has a very intriguing postdoc project entitled Technoscientific Futures in the Making: Transgenic Mosquitoes as Contested Public Health Technologies, that explores the transgenic mosquito OX513A, built to combat mosquitoes transmitting the Zika virus and dengue fever, and understands it as a bio-object. Maybe this is also something interesting we could come back to in our joint discussion later, especially since Catherine Hayles has also very recently written a short piece on corona as a posthuman virus. But now I am very much looking forward to your talk, Josef, entitled Cutting Technology and the Body Together Apart, Bodies in Technologies and the Haunting Climate of Materializations. Please, Josef, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Maria, for this kind introduction. I would also like to thank Patricia Dunder and Franziska Lienhardt for organizing this fantastic symposium full of exciting talks and discussions. It's a great pleasure to be part of it, and of course also a privilege to be in a panel together with Catherine Hayles. What does it mean to follow a ghost? In the Spectres of Marx, Jacques Derrida suspects that following a ghost might come down to being haunted by it, persecuted by the very chase we are leading. What if the idea that bodies, along with their boundaries and properties, precede their relations is such a ghost? What if technology, far from being the other of the body, pervading it from an outside, is always already part of our material practices of embodiment, yet with very different embodied and material consequences? On March 25, 1999, Baltimore Circuit Judge Joseph H. Kaplan denied a request by Owens Corning Corporation to bar black steelworkers who became ill with asbestosis and lung cancer from suing the former asbestos manufacturer. In contrast to their white colleagues, the company refused the payment of disability claims to black workers who were trying to prove that the illness and diminished lung capacity was a result of their exposure to asbestos. Confronted with the accusation of racial bias, Owens Corning defended its position as objective and scientifically grounded, claiming that people of color, and particularly black people, consistently scored lower than white test subjects when measuring vital capacity, effectively requiring them to meet a higher standard to prove lung damage and be eligible for compensation in the case of serious illness and disability. Now that black patients are treated unequally in the US, and of course also elsewhere, remains a fact. From the Tuskegee syphilis study, which violated all ethical standards for the sake of observing the natural development of untreated syphilis in several hundred black males, until most of the study participants had died 40 years later, to the current COVID-19 pandemic, which hits black disproportionately strongly, with nearly 5 times higher rates of hospitalization. Dorothy Roberts, Harriet A. Washington, and other scholars have repeatedly shown that patients of color, and in particular black patients, not only receive less medical attention and care, but are often also treated too late. The use of the spirometer in the Baltimore lawsuit and elsewhere in order to technologically enforce the demand that black patients objectively demonstrate more serious lung damage than white ones, in order to be both treated medically and eligible for compensation payment, has to be understood in this light as well. In Breathing Race into the Machine, historian of science Lundy Brown demonstrates in great detail how the past of the spirometer haunts the bodies of those marked as the other. Designed as an experimental apparatus for measuring vital capacity, which is the maximum volume of air a person can expel from their lungs after a maximum inhalation, for the past 1.5 centuries, the spirometer has stood at the center of questions about biological difference and the different quality and value of human life. Mapping the material and socio-technical practices by which race became, quote, deeply but invisibly entrenched in the hardware and software of the machine itself, end quote, Brown reconstructs how the spirometer has become an instrument that produces purported objective truth about the nature of the bodies under examination. From the plantation complexes of the southern US to the Baltimore lawsuit, the spirometer not only embodies, but also enforces the idea that black bodies are inherently less vital than white ones. Brown provides us with a highly insightful historical analysis that takes into account the social and economic interests, as well as the ideological beliefs that are embedded in the spirometer, as a technical apparatus, tying past and present together. The spirometer, in this light, not only represents an indispensable medical instrument for identifying pulmonary diseases, but also an instrument of racial oppression. However, if racial bias has been built into the instrument, it can also be built out, and the spirometer turned into a less biased and more objective instrument. At least this is the general tone that accompanies much of recent racial health discourses. But is the question really one of technological accuracy and neutrality, of measure and mismeasure, of fixing bias and racism through more objective technologies, one might ask? Or is it not the very relationship between technology, bodies, and race that we must return to? Not in the sense of, quote, reflecting on or going back to a past that was, but returning as in turning it over and over again in order to produce new temporalities, new diffraction patterns, as Karen Barat suggests. Now, this is not Heidegger's turning or Kehre here in the sense of a reflexive gesture through which a different relationship to being, technology, and the world is made possible, but a revisiting and reversing, or zurückkehren und umkehren, if you like, in one move that reworks matter and meaning along with the past, present, and future. Hence, returning is always about calling up specters out of joint with the time, since haunting, as Derrida reminds us, quote, is historical, to be sure, but it's not dated. It is never docilely given in the date in the chain of presence, end quote. In what follows, I will return to mid-19th and early 20th century technosomatic discourses about matter, vitality, and race that unfold around the spirometer, and diffract them through insights from Black cultural theory and feminist new materialisms in order to propose a different story. There is a reason that Donna Haraway keeps reminding us that stories are thick, material, semiotic practices. Stories are performative. They do something. They help us to enact, stabilize, or also destabilize particular worlds at the exclusion of others. Haraway, this is precisely why, quote, it matters what stories we tell other stories with. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories, end quote. So telling stories is about relaying relations that matter in order to bring the past and with it that which was not there and which is perhaps still absent into the present. In the story I'm going to tell, the spirometer, instead of being a technology that either measures or mismeasures bodies, marks a techno apparatus of bodily production. As such, it lies at the heart of reconfigurations of the entanglement of technology and bodies, racialized matter and meaning. In The Sound of Culture, Diaspora and Black Technopoetics, Louis Judith Oakey makes the strong claim that, I quote, race and technology came together in the Victorian era, as Europeans were forced to make sense of the implications of colonial expansion and the repercussions of industrial power, end quote. Since then, race has followed the development of technology like a haunting. And indeed, the spirometer and the modern scientific notion of race are both products of the mid-19th century, soon making their way from class-obsessed Victorian England to the race-fixated plantation system of the antebellum US South. Why the belief in an allegedly undeniable, quote, difference of structure in the pulmonary apparatus, end quote, that supposedly rendered Black people less suitable for freedom, but all the more for forced labor, can be already found in Thomas Jefferson's note on the state of Virginia from 1785. Such claims lacked empirical evidence. It was against this backdrop that apparatuses were thought which would objectively, that is, scientifically support these beliefs and imaginations. So in the pro-slavery anthology Cotton is King, Samuel Cartwright, a physician who also happened to be a planter, attempted precisely that, quote, to answer by the spirometer. Claiming to have conducted a plethora of experiments and observations employing the spirometer, Cartwright saw the framers of the US Constitution to be justified in differentiating between two races upon the basis of the amount of oxygen they consume. For Cartwright, it seemed evident that because of the supposed natural distinction, judging Black people by spirometrical data made on white people would, quote, indicate in the former a morbid condition when none existed, end quote. Using the spirometer, Cartwright was not only the first to frame difference as objectively measurable deficiency, as he puts it, but also to present it as, quote, a distinction which nature has made. Now, Cartwright, however, not only invented the perpetually feeble and inert Black body that was dependent on forced labor, but also used the spirometer to reinforce the idea that races could not survive outside their climate of origin. So the body here becomes inextricably bound up with its corresponding environment, and every attempt to change this natural law was seen as futile and potentially deadly. So it is for this reason that Cartwright emphasized how important forced labor in, I quote, a close and hot atmosphere for Black slaves supposedly was, and went on to come up with a number of invented melodies to pathologize resistance against planters, such as the destruction of the machines and tools through slaves, who in a sense, as Louis Judith Oakey today already said, were also considered as just that, tools. While the plantation system itself did function as a technology that was fueled by humans denied their humanity and bound up with imaginations about climate and environment, as W.E.B. Du Bois, Sylvia Wynter, Alexander Vehely, Achille Mbembe, and Louis Judith Oakey, and many other Black intellectuals highlight, discourses on the relationship between race, bodies, technology, and environment continued long after slavery had been formally abolished in the US, as did the vital role of the spirometer as an apparatus for determining vital capacity, and along with it, a purported deficiency of Black bodies. The work of the statistician Frederick Hoffman is only one example for how the spirometer sustained its key role as an apparatus for the enactment of difference as deficiency, stabilizing and in an important sense, as I will demonstrate shortly, also destabilizing the boundaries between marked bodies in their interaction with technology and environment. Even though Hoffman was not a physician, he was convinced that the lungs were clearly, quote, the most important of all determining factors among physical measurements, end quote, and race at the heart of the struggle for life. Stating that in large cities of the early 20th century, Black people could only, quote, lead a precarious existence, however not because of racism and social exclusion, but rather due to their alleged, quote, smaller lung capacity, which in itself was a proof of an inferior physical organism, end quote. Hoffman concluded that insuring Black clients would add little to the progress and prosperity of the state. So just at the time when Black people became citizens and corporations gained corporate personhood in the US, Hoffman was providing insurance companies with the proof needed that allowed them to consider Black clients uninsurable persons. We just heard in Louis Dusoke's talk how the notion of juridical personhood that was proposed here has to be understood as intimately connected or entangled with chattel slavery. So the standardization projects that followed in decades to come paved the way for the scientifically backed idea that patients of color, and in particular Black patients, are in need of what is called in medical terms race correction. Since the lungs or the lung function and vitality were apparently substantially lower than that of white people by nature. And it is this idea and practice embodied in and enforced by the spirometer that still haunts Black bodies. Given its vital role in enforcing racial injustice, it is hard not to think of the spirometer as a biopolitical technology for managing bodies. Returning to the aforementioned discourses on technology, bodies, and race, however, suggests that there is much more to it than the question of measurement and mismeasurement, technological bias, and the disciplining of mute and inert bodies. The fact that bodily flows and forces had to be tamed, as Lundy Brown emphasizes, almost in passing, in order to be able to categorize lungs as normal or abnormal, not only shows that over the past century and a half, lungs provided to be resistant against attempts at standardization and normalization, but also demonstrates that measurements have materializing and therefore also ontological effects. Measuring and materializing are inextricably entangled with one another, as are technology and bodies here. Or to put it differently, measurement is constitutive with what is measured. The relationship between technology and bodies becomes visible here as one that is not characterized by exteriority or connectivity, but rather by relational indeterminacy. As the feminist science studies scholar Karen Barat tells us, indeterminacy, in contrast to uncertainty, is less about the possibility of accurate representations or knowledge, and all the more about the entangled state of knowing, being, and responding to the other. Contesting the Cartesian belief in pre-existing, distinct entities which, with given boundaries and properties, Barat not only proposes the notion of interaction, which basically holds that distinct phenomena or agencies do not proceed, but rather emerge through their interactions, but also provides us with the notion of the agential cut. While Cartesian cuts are absolute, agential cuts refer to the practice of cutting together apart, or quote, the holding together of the disparate itself. It is in this light that Barat concludes that we misunderstand the nature of materialization if we assume that individual entities and agencies precede their interaction or their interaction. Quote, relations do not follow relata, but the other way around. Matter is neither fixed and given nor the mere end result of different processes. Matter is produced and productive, generated and generative. Matter is agentive, not a fixed essence or property of things. Matter is differentiating. And which differences come to matter? Matter in the iterative production of different differences. End quote. Technology and bodies together apart is therefore not about erasing differences, nor are the agential cuts that apparatuses enact timeless. Rather, this approach points to the idea that technology and bodies exist in a relational state of interaction, and that it is only through material discursive practices, that is, through apparatuses, that relational indeterminacy is resolved locally and temporarily. So far from being a prosthesis or the other of the body, technology therefore refers to a relational mode of being that lies at the heart of processes of mattering. As Hathaway has powerfully argued, technology is indeed about intimate connections, or perhaps about interactions. And for sure, it matters which ones get made and unmade. At the same time, the body that is foregrounded in this framework is not the cybernetic body, for it's not about hybridity or connectivity after the fact. Rather, what a body is, what it can do, and where its boundaries lie is defined, though not determined, through the apparatus it forms a part of. Bodies are embedded in technology, or bodies in technology, just as much as technology is always part of our embodiment. This move, however, neither implies a sort of ahistoricity nor a form of relativism, because interactions and the cuts apparatuses enact matter in every sense of the word, as the spirometer demonstrates. So tending to the cuts through which the spirometer as an apparatus enacts racialized matter and meaning, the rejection of the idea of black bodies as passive matter and as biologically inferior does not mean portraying them in turn as plastic and moldable matter. In fact, as Zakiya Ayman Jackson emphasizes, ontological plasticity is itself at the heart of anti-black racism. Quote, "Plasticity," Jackson writes, "is a mode of transmogrification, whereby the fleshy being of blackness is experimented with, as if it were infinitely malleable lexical and biological matter, such that blackness is produced as sub/super/human at once, a form where form shall not hold, potentially everything and nothing at the register of ontology." End quote. So plasticity, according to Jackson, marks the practices through which the very being of black bodies is erased, rendering black bodies infinitely mutable. Historically, this can be witnessed, for example, when enslaved black bodies were considered analogically to automatons, making them less than human, but also other than, and occasionally even more than human. However, this idea can also be encountered in contemporary discourses on racial health, where black bodies are seen as both receptors of environmental influence and boundlessly moldable by the individual subject. However, what the calls to manage the body and to take responsibility for its health and optimization usually disregard is not only structural, institutional, and systemic racism, but also the potentially unruliness of bodies. Returning to the entangled past and present of the spirometer as a techno-apparatus of bodily production shifts our attention to the agencies inherent to bodies. This is not to be romanticized or celebrated, though, as bodily responses to their natural cultural environments can also be regarded as producing the very conditions of possibility for getting ill and for disability. Pulmonary diseases such as lung cancer and asbestosis, for example, are then not only materializing effects of interactions with natural cultural environments, which, by the way, do not mark an outside or an exteriority of the body, but also a somatic response to centuries of injustice and racism. Returning to the spirometer as a nexus for the relational production of racialized matter and meaning also demonstrates something else, though, namely what Christina Sharp means when she speaks of, quote, anti-blackness as total climate, as the atmospheric condition of time and place, end quote. The materialization of marked bodies in this light is as pervasive as the climate. It forms a haunting totality from which there is no escape and, quote, in which the push is always toward Black Death. So in this talk, I've tried to demonstrate that instead of being a mere technical object, instrument, or tool, the spirometer constitutes a techno-apparatus of bodily production. As such, in its interaction with bodies, it enacts specifically reconfigured lungs, that is, matter, along with particular meanings, such as vitality as a purported racial trait. The spirometer, therefore, does not so much map the terrain of the body as it materializes specifically marked or reconfigured bodies, which themselves are not passive objects. With vital capacity or vitality, then, too, is neither something that can be found somewhere out there, meaning a natural fact, nor is it a purely social construction. Ironically, it could be said that from its very beginnings on, the spirometer has not only enforced but also undermined the belief in a passive and inert body, along with the distinction between matter and meaning, as well as between technology, the body, and race. It is the, quote, black visual sonic resistance to that imposition of non-being as Christina Sharp stresses, the insistence that neither race nor vital capacity is a natural and immutable truth, what allowed black scholars, such as the Harvard University mathematician Kelly Miller, to contest Hoffman's gloomy warning of an imagined extinction of black lives due to their purported bodily traits that would haunt them relentlessly. If the body is indeed, quote, inferior in vital function and power, Miller responded, then he or it will be a public benefactor who scientifically demonstrates the fact. But the colored race most stubbornly refuses to be argued out of existence, end quote. If racialized bodies and meanings materialize iteratively through practices, that is, through apparatuses, then race too cannot refer to something that can be found in bodies, neither in the sense of a purported biological truth, nor as a sociocultural construction that is inscribed in passive bodies. It is for this reason that the calls to program racial bias out of technologies are not enough, for they remain caught up in the idea of the possibility of neutral technology and of objective measurements as practices of simply mapping pre-existing bodies. Measurements, however, are performative, and so are stories as another kind of technology that help us in stabilizing and destabilizing worlds. Now, if returning is about revisiting and reversing what is past, but make no mistake, it is not about repairing the past and even less about salvation, then haunting is about another kind of returning, namely that of the relentless presence of something that, even if reconfigured, does not go away. Quote, the past is never closed, Barat reminds us, never finished once and for all, but there is no taking it back, setting time aright, putting the world back on its axis. There is no erasure finally. To address the past and future, to speak with ghosts, is not to entertain or reconstruct some narrative of the way it was, but to respond, to be responsible, to take responsibility for that which we inherit from the past and the future. End quote. As inheritance comes with a call to responsibility, as Derrida highlights, it is through returning as responding that we cease chasing ghosts and finally, or might finally, speak of and with them. However, in order to do so, in the case of the spirometer and the idea of vitality as a purported racial trait, we not only have to give up the idea of technology as the other of the body, but also long-told stories about technological neutrality and inert bodily matter. It is only then that we will be able to see that after all, objectivity does matter, not in the sense of technological neutrality or accuracy, but as being responsible for and accountable to the marks left on bodies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josef, for this great talk that has addressed many issues that are crucial to our panel from a very important and I would say very urgent perspective. And I think that both talks resonate very interestingly with each other, but also with the conference and the other talks. And we have no time to discuss these issues further with the two panelists. So please come back with me, Catherine, Josef. And while I'm sure you have many questions, hey, hello. I'm sure you have many questions for each other, but maybe permit me to start with a very simple and open question, which is related to the context we are discussing in today. Catherine, in an interview that I've already quoted before, you discuss human consciousness as an epiphenomenon. That is, consciousness has to be understood, as you say, as an emergent property arising from the interactions of more fundamental properties. Or as you go on saying, consciousness is a latecomer to the party that arrogates it to itself center stage while actually taking its cues from fundamental actors that it cannot see, but that nevertheless guide, constrain, or enable its operations. So that means that there's a kind of determinism, a constraint, as you say, or at least interference in the doings of consciousness, which then poses a problem to the doctrine of the autonomous subject, as you have shown in your books, obviously. But I was then wondering how this limitation of human freedom to act and to think maybe this constraint, maybe also this constraint from the milieu, one could say, is transposed to artistic creativity or to discourse on artistic creativity and the artistic subject that still deals very much with these questions of artistic freedom and autonomy. Or put differently, how would you think the convergence between the theoretical framework of the posthuman and the aesthetic discussions of the author and his deconstruction? So I was wondering if you maybe could say a few words on this convergence.
Well, thank you, Marie, for that question. So in my book, Unthought, I tried to point out notions similar to what you just quoted from the interview, and that is that cognition is a much broader faculty than consciousness alone, and cognition draws upon embodied capacities that are not processed directly by consciousness, but in fact go through a neuronal level of processing that I called non-conscious cognition. So non-conscious cognition is receiving all of these inputs from the body, from the senses, internal senses as well, analyzing them for patterns, synthesizing them, creating a coherent body representation out of it. And all of that occurs before consciousness begins to operate. So non-conscious cognition comes online something like 200 milliseconds after the onset of stimuli, where consciousness doesn't even begin to perceive that anything is happening until about half a second or 500 milliseconds. So it's much slower in its uptake than non-conscious cognition. It has a much more limited information processing capacity, and it's unable to detect patterns that are too information rich for it to understand what's happening, whereas non-conscious cognition can discern those patterns much more quickly and adeptly than consciousness can. So I think it's important to understand that cognition is broader than consciousness. Cognition is broader than what is traditionally referred to as thought or thinking, and it draws upon embodied capacities that are much deeper and more resilient than consciousness itself. So, so consciousness is what controls what Damasio has called the narrating self. Consciousness is very much bound up with creating a narrative of selfhood, and it's that narrative of selfhood that creates for us the illusion that we have a unified self. But the experience of being a person is much broader than that of being a self. And it entails other kinds of cognitive capacities that go beyond consciousness. So I define cognition in the broadest terms possible as a process of interpreting information in contexts that connect it with meaning. So in this sense, in my view, all biological life forms have cognitive capacities, including plants, including all animals, including those without brains or central nervous systems. So I'm trying to imagine a framework which would allow us to escape the worst effects of anthropocentrism, recognizing that all biological life forms have cognitive capacities and are capable of creating meaning and engaging in meaning-making practices. But once you define cognition in those terms, it's obvious that there are technical cognizers as well as biological cognizers. There are technical systems that interpret information from their environment and engage in meaning-making practices within their context. So this is a contextual framework. It's rooting meaning in relation to context. Meaning emerges from very specific contexts and very specific embodiments.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Maybe we can come back to that later. I think it's fascinating and very interesting. I was Franzi mentioned that I'm working on Roger Caillois quite a bit these last weeks and months and years actually, and he proposes something like a natural aesthetics. So I was wondering if that might be something where the aesthetic dimension would also be come into what you all just explained or just exposed. No, if there's an aesthetic dimension to the biological life form in a way, as Caillois in some texts suggests.
You also creativity along with aesthetics, and this notion of cognition makes it clear, I think, that creativity is by no means limited only to consciousness, but creativity emerges from deeper sources of cognition, including non-conscious cognition. And I think creative people have always recognized that something deeper or outside of consciousness breaks into consciousness as a kind of realization or synthesis of what has already been understood at another level in deeper ways. So if creativity has these sources that are tied up with embodiment in specific contexts, then it follows that aesthetics is not only a judgment of consciousness, but aesthetics is also a whole body response to a situation or an object. It means that your gut is involved in your aesthetic appreciation as much as your brain is, because your gut is also a source of powerful non-conscious cognition. And again, I think these are not new ideas, that these kinds of ideas can be dated back to the Romans and before the Romans, in effect. But it's only recently that we've developed the kind of research methods that allow us to talk about this in specific and neurological terms.
Thank you so much for the specification. I'd kind of like to reframe a similar question for you, Joseph. You have been speaking about the, I quote, bodies and technologies as sites and agents of biopolitical struggles. And I was wondering how these bodies related to the so-called, again, creative subject that also appears to be a kind of revenant, such as those that you have shown us in your pictures, in your slides, but a revenant, in this case rather of the Enlightenment and its Western dreams of autonomy and freedom. And this also brings me to the second part of my question, which explicitly relates to the different pictures of contemporary African artists that you have shown us. And I would be very interested to know, or maybe you would like to elaborate a bit on why you choose these artists and what they meant for your thinking and writing process.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I think, maybe I just answer the first part of the question first. So I think when it comes to the body, I actually wanted to bring up two different, but of course, connected things. On the one hand, I wanted to kind of propose an understanding of bodies as active or agentic, rather than as blank slates or passive matter that basically awaits cultural inscription. But that's not really new. I mean, Judith Butler did it already more than 20 years ago, and others did it too, as we heard in the presentations earlier today, right? So, but I think that there is still much literature on technology, especially in continental philosophy, that sort of remains caught in the narrative of a natural body or nature itself that is threatened by invasive technology, or so as if technology was something that intrudes from the outside. And I do not necessarily have in mind that white males, such as, I don't know, Arnold Gehn or Martin Heidegger here, but also still alive ones like Jürgen Habermas, but also feminist scholars. So, and on the and I think that's the more important point. I neither wanted to argue that that it is the body as a kind of distinct entity that acts, or even acts intentionally, nor do I want to romanticize bodily agency, because I think what the history of the spirometer understood as an apparatus, not as a confined technology or a kind of, I don't know, instrument, shows us pretty well is that bodily agency or responses to toxic environments or climates, and I include racism in that too, that they come in different shapes and forms, such as, for instance, in getting ill or getting cancer or getting tumors. So becoming ill and developing tumors then would also have to be acknowledged as a form of bodily agency, right? And when I started my doctoral thesis, this was not that widely acknowledged, I think. Of course, there's more literature on that today, especially in Black posthumanist philosophies. I just think of Zakiya Ayman-Jackson's work here. So, but I think what is really important is that I don't want to argue that there is a body which acts intentionally. It's always bodies as part of apparatuses or as bodies in technology, right? I don't know, does it answer the first part of the question? Or?
Catherine Hayes has a... Please.
Sorry, yeah.
So, I want to say I thought your presentation was great, that your example of a spirometer as showing that technology is not neutral was entirely convincing. And I think you've really expanded the archive here for all of us of how one might make that claim. But I have trouble with one specific aspect of your argument that I'd like to engage you with. And that is your idea, which you're taking straight out of Barad, that entities don't pre-exist relation, but rather they emerge from the relation. I'm a great admirer of Barad's Meeting the Universe Halfway. I think, it was a fantastic and important book. But if you look carefully at the structure of that book, she's making the argument on the basis of quantum interactions between electrons and subatomic particles and so forth. And then she skips to applying these results from the micro realm to the macro realm with very little intervening tissue. So she's merely supposing, not demonstrating, that events on the macro scale are homologous with events on the micro scale. And that's where you get the kind of conclusions that you were drawing, that entities do not precede relation but come out of relation. But let's apply that to a human infant. What kind of relations is that body coming out of? Well, essentially infinite numbers of relations. The relations with the mother's body first and foremost in the development of the fetus. And then enculturation begins, as we know already, in the womb. And then when the baby is born, there's infinite numbers of relations in which that baby is engaging, and the older the baby grows into a child and then adult, the more those relationships proliferate. So out of which relationship is that body emerging? You would have to say an infinite number of relations, which makes it a non-explanation. It's a non-explanation if you try to apply it to the macro scale, because you would have to specify an infinite number of relations out of which this body is emerging. So it becomes essentially useless as an analytical concept, because you're applying it at the macro scale, you're not applying it at the micro scale. And ditto with the bodies that I was talking about, these robot bodies. Out of what relationships do they emerge? Well, there's, again, an almost infinite number of relations, from the programmers to the metals, rare earth metals involved in their fabrication, and so on and so forth. So I don't think this is very useful as an explanatory concept because of this enormous gap between the micro scale and the macro scale. And I don't think that your claim that technology is not root neutral really depends on it. I think you showed quite convincingly with a spirometer exactly why technology is not neutral, exactly why measurement is not neutral, because you're always determining what the measurement is going to be and what it's going to mean in a cultural context and so forth. The weakest part of that entire argument, it seems to me, is this idea that entities don't pre-exist their relation. On the contrary, I would argue that entities do pre-exist their relation, and there's no other feasible way to think about them other than as pre-existing their relation, because otherwise you're confronting an infinity of forces. So as someone who has found this framework useful, I wonder how you would respond to this critique.
Right, thank you so much. A lot of points. So I think Barad would say that that we are already that it's already a mistake if we assume that there is a difference between the macro and the micro level, or between the microscopic world and the macroscopic world. So because her argument, drawing on Bohr, and you know it better probably than I do, but is that that this distinction is itself actually something that we construct. Therefore she says that basically everything that happens on the quantum level also applies for what we call the macro level. But I agree that analytically, if you want to really use it as a kind of like an empirical method, then it's getting difficult because, as you said, there are infinite relations, and it becomes really difficult to determine where a specific apparatus ends and where another one begins. And Barad would say, probably she would say that that's already problematic if we ask that question, because every apparatus is interacting with other apparatuses every time. So it's always about interactions, and we have to look at the agential cuts that actually actually enact a specific phenomenon. So it's not about, the question is not about what relations we have to look at, because it's not anymore about a human subject that is calling the shots in a sense. So she says that the observer or the agencies of observation is always part of the apparatus. Right, but I agree. I wouldn't really use it as an empirical method in a sense. But I think for my purpose here, I really think that it is useful just when it comes to the question of measurement and the question of the possible neutrality of technology or not neutrality of technology, because it helps to get a feeling for that it's not just about that measurement is not about mapping, that measurement is performative, that it's about enacting specific phenomena or specific materialities and meanings. So, and I think in this sense, I kind of really found it useful to think about the spirometer, not just as a technology which is biased and which has a racialized history, but also as a apparatus which is not just confined to the technical instrument, that does more than just mapping bodies, but also materializing them. So,
yeah, I can definitely see the materializing bodies aspect of this. Well, I'll just make one final observation and then let us move on to other issues. It's manifestly not the case that you can apply micro scale in the same way you can macro scale. Otherwise, it would be impossible to have Newtonian mechanics. The difference between Newtonian mechanics and quantum mechanics is precisely the issue of scale. And it's Newtonian mechanics that lets us calculate the trajectories of rockets, which would be impossible if we remained at the quantum scale. So I think that part of the argument is simply not correct. But let us move on to other issues.
Yeah. May just a quick answer. I mean, I'm not a quantum or a particle physicist, so but how I understand it is that, or how Barad probably would say is that that actually everything can be answered with quantum mechanics, and why we apply Newtonian physics, for example, for the trajectories of ballistic missiles, is because it's easier but it's not that accurate, and we can do it with quantum mechanics too, but it would be harder. So
I would really like to see that, figuring a rocket trajectory by quantum mechanics, but okay, let us move on.
Right, but maybe just to the second part of the question, if we have time for that, Maria, I don't know.
Yeah, please. That would be very interesting if you could just come back to your pictures, the artists you've chosen for your talk.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not an art theorist, so I will leave it to the experts here who are more qualified to interpret and discuss the works of art, which are incorporated. But the reason why I incorporate those images, and maybe we can just come back to them when I talk about them, but I think, first of all, it's important to highlight that the sculptures and the collages on my slides are not meant to be decorative, because they constitute an important part of the paper, of my paper or the talk. And I would really say that that they informed my thoughts, even diffracted them in a sense, insofar as they were present when I returned to the discourses on technology, bodies and race, while I was writing this paper. And this is particularly true for the work of Nandifa Mutambo and Wageshi Mutu. Because what fascinates me in Mutambo is how her work charts, and in doing so maybe also, I would say, the boundary between what is considered a human body and an animal or a non-human body, if you like, exactly by turning to feminized bodies, which historically functioned as sort of markers for the borders between human and non-human, civilized and primitive, or subject and object, and even more so when it comes to feminized bodies of color, right? And especially the lithograph on, I think it's on slide number 4, if you can return to that. It's called Resolution 2. And this is, by the way, just a detail of the piece on the slide. In the original, we can see also a conjoined twin on the right-hand side, touching their own body or their bodies. And that really struck me when I encountered it, I think, I don't know, but by accident 2 years ago or so. And when I started working on it, on this paper earlier this month, it sort of returned and was always present and part of me in engagement with breath and the racialized history of breath and breathing, and also, of course, the role of measurement. The other artist whose work has been really important for this presentation is, of course, Wageshi Mutu, who also deals a lot with the entanglement, and I would also add disentanglement of racialized ungendered bodies, of course. And I think that's on slide 15 and 17. And so I actually decided to incorporate those two collages because I think that they resonate with the whole idea of, on the one hand, the ill black body, which is exhibited in a sense, or also becomes kind of a spectacle, and which is responsible for becoming ill because of decisions made or not made, as, for instance, Dorothy Roberts and other stress. But on the other hand, I think these pieces can also can be also read, and that's what I did, as powerful, as a powerful reworking of adult bodies, because they disrupt the boundaries between the organic and the artificial, or interior and exteriority, or racialized and sexed flesh and objective instruments. So, which only would measure the body without, as I just said, without intervening or producing something.
Joseph, and time is running, I'm afraid. And I'm sure there are many questions also from the other panelists that will now join us on Zoom. So if there are questions, please raise your hands. I cannot see you right now. well, so maybe it takes some time for the images to come up. I cannot see anyone at the moment. Then I just go on talking because I'm, it's gonna come. Okay, so now I'm starting to see people's faces. Is there a question for our panelists from the Zoom talk? Otherwise, if they are still thinking, I might, Joseph wants to ask a question. Otherwise, I could just go on. Yeah. So do I just go on? Okay. So I have another question for like a shorter question for Catherine. You on your last slide, you were when you were talking about technosymbiosis, no, as like the benign cooperation, and you also mentioned the algorithmic governmentality as kind of the negative counterpart in a way. No, and I would be very interesting to know how you would see the interaction between these two notions, and also like between these two mechanisms in a way. No, or if the question would be if there is a way, or if you would think of a way to escape what we call, or what we've been calling, algorithmic governmentality. Is there a kind of resistance to that, and is it linked to the technosymbiosis?
Well, this is something I've been thinking a lot about lately in the US context specifically. How much social media and algorithms associated with social media have changed political discourse in the US, and I'm sure in Germany and globally as well. And for all of the benefits of social media, it seems to me that the disadvantages of that kind of algorithmic governmentality are now becoming clearer and clearer with the events specifically in the US of January 6th, where we saw the riot and assault on the US Capitol by Trump supporters. And the whole nature of how discourse proceeds has just been radically changed and made much more vulnerable to extremism through the mechanisms of social media in particular. And there's been a long controversy about whether social media platforms should censor content of one kind or another. And I know that's a very complex issue, but it's an issue that is confronting us now in the States at every level. So there's a wonderful documentary called The Social Dilemma about how these platforms grew and how the veering into the shoals of extremism has happened throughout the last couple of decades. I think this is an extremely serious issue globally, not only in the US, but the rise of extremists, the rise of conspiracy theorists, the rise of all of these absolutely nonsensical ideas can be traced, I think, directly to the disseminating possibilities of using algorithms in order to communicate. So that's what's most on my mind at the moment. And for all the complexities of the issue, I remain one of those people who think that it is absolutely key to have enlightened regulation on this issue by governments. This is not a complete answer by any means, but I think that enlightened regulation is absolutely crucial to keep this situation getting even more serious than it is right now.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So I will take some questions from the virtual audience, which have reached me via chat. And I have a question for Josef Bahler. Thank you for your very interesting talk, someone says. And at the very end of your talk, you talk about objectivity, that after all, objectivity does matter. Could you elaborate a bit on your notion of objectivity?
Right. Right, thank you. So I think, so objectivity is actually connected to the notion of returning. I'm kind of developing or employing here. And so maybe I just start by defining what I mean by that. So as I said, returning is not about reflecting as in reconstructing. So it's not about accuracy or the search for truth. Instead, I would say that it is kind of a conceptual tool which produces differences that matter. And but turning to that which we actually also return to something, we diffract it with other matters and insights, such as, for instance, what I did in the presentation here with the work of Black intellectuals on race, technology, and bodies, but also the work of art here. And I think so returning comes basically down to the practices of responding to the other, to that which we inherit from the past, or ghosts, if you wish. And then speaking with rather than about ghosts would probably mean to take our responsibility for the bodies, but also, as Donna Haraway probably would say, for the worlds that we help in materializing or that we help in enacting. And of course, also in a very important sense for those which do not come to matter. So this is also why I actually ended my talk with a call for objectivity, even after I have basically problematized these fantasies of objectivity and accuracy in the context of technological measurement for the most part of the talk. But I would say that this notion of objectivity is not about accuracy or the accurate mapping and representing of something, for example, phenomenon or the bodies, but really about the whole idea of materializing bodies or of materializing specific phenomena. And again, this humanist subject, which is actually calling the shots here, and also practicing what Donna Haraway has termed the God trick of seeing everything from nowhere, but rather as part of apparatuses. So again, I think objectivity here then would mean taking responsibility for the bodies and the worlds which we help enacting and those which do not come to matter, if that answers the question.
Catherine, you wanted to react?
Yeah, I'd like to say something to this as well. And I very much appreciate Josef's returning to a call for objectivity at the end of his talk. I think that Bruno Latour has also been very eloquent on precisely the kind of dilemma that the word objectivity presents to the STS community. So we've gone through 4 decades or so of critique of the idea of objectivity, and some of that Josef mentioned in his talk, but of course there's much, much more. And all of those critiques were useful. All of those critiques were valid in my view. And yet they have given fuel to those who would say there is no objectivity at all. And facts don't matter, evidence doesn't matter. And again, speaking specifically in a US context, I'll just say how devastating this stance is for a democracy, and having, you know, our past president been one of the foremost practitioners of the idea that facts don't matter, we can see what kind of pervasive damage that it's done to the society and to, indeed to the whole world. So there has to be some notion that facts do matter, that evidence does matter, that there are ways to make evidence-based arguments which are superior to arguments not based on any evidence at all. And of course, the whole idea that the last election was illegitimate is a perfect example of a fact-free assertion. So democracy is really on the line here in rescuing some robust notion of objectivity. And I appreciate the idea of linking objectivity with taking responsibility, but I would say that's not enough. It's not enough simply to say that objectivity means we take responsibility, because that provides us with no way to distinguish between fact-free arguments and arguments based on evidence. I think we have to go further than that, and we have to say, yes, there is such a thing as facts. There are such a thing as evidential procedures that allow us to determine claims which are robust from claims that are not robust. And for me, it was one of the profound misunderstandings of the science wars of the 1980s and 1990s that the scientists misunderstood the critiques coming out of STS to saying there is no possibility of objectivity. I don't think that's what those critiques were saying at all. What those critiques were saying was that there is a power of disconfirmation in scientific procedures that is enormously important, that it allows us to distinguish between a theory that's not consistent with our experience of reality and a theory that is consistent with our experience of reality. Every utterance, as Haraway has pointed out, has to be indexed to our experience of reality. We have no way, as Joseph just said, to accomplish the God's trick of speaking from nowhere. We're always speaking from a situation, but nevertheless, what we can say is that some constructions of reality are not consistent with our experience of reality, and therefore they are inferior to other constructions of reality which are consistent with our experience. So I think that to Joseph's idea and Haraway's idea and many other people's idea of taking responsibility, yes, we need to take responsibility, but in addition to that, we have to insist that we have the power of disconfirmation, not only the power of confirmation, but the power of disconfirmation, of identifying facts, statements, and theories which are not consistent with our experience.
Right.
I have
If I may
another.
just
Of course.
Just respond. Just a sentence. I completely agree, and that's also I think why people like Latour and others say that without shared values there's no shared world, and that also that it's not about going away from the facts and institutions, but actually understanding that facts are fragile and that they are stabilized by different actors, and it's not that, as you said, the whole idea behind the science was is not that, or behind the critique from SDS is not that we have to go away from facts, that everything is just value, right? And I think that was a huge misunderstanding, and that was also why Latour, I think he mentioned this article he wrote in 2005, I think, why he says that actually facts are dissolving, and SDS maybe gave way to what we call today alternative facts, or conspiracy theories in a sense. So I think it's really important to have an idea that facts are not something that we find somewhere out there, but they are kind of constructed in a sense, but they're still that are stabilized, but they're still necessary and important. So.
I have still a few questions from the chat that I would like to bring into the discussion. And there is one question for Catherine. Thank you both for your insightful contributions. My question is for Catherine. Could you elaborate on how the sculptural and the robotic intersect?
I'm sorry, you cut out for just a moment. I didn't hear the full
question.
Yeah,
could you, so it's a question for you. Could you elaborate on how the sculptural and the robotic intersect? Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, Joseph identified the areas in which he is not expert. I should identify sculpture as an area in which I am Hartford. So my comments may seem very naive in this regard, but I do know enough to know that there has been a strong tradition in sculpture of breaking down the idea that there's a boundary between everyday objects and artistic objects. And Duchamp, of course, was doing this with his ready-mades and so on and so forth. And sometimes the difference between the everyday object and the art object is simply their situatedness. Is it in a museum? If it's in a museum, then it has to be an art object, even if it is indistinguishable from a ready-made object. So I think Boston Dynamics had no idea that they were inventing sculptural forms with these robotic bodies. They were simply dealing with all the technical issues of how you create a mobile robot that can deal with an unpredictable environment. And yet we can do a change of perception and look at these not as the everyday objects, but rather as artistic objects, objects in motion, which again has a whole tradition in sculpture, that sculpture is not only about static bodies, but also plastic bodies which are moving and dynamic. And these bodies are definitely dynamic, and in fact their dynamic interactions with the environment are sort of at the heart of what their programming is about. And so in that sense, I think they would be fascinating to study from a sculptural viewpoint. I'm not myself prepared to undertake that kind of study, but I would welcome sculptors and critics of sculptures to think about bodies like this as sculptural objects and bring their rich history and repertoire of knowledge to bear on what can be said about robotic objects as sculptures.
Thank you very much. I have another question to you, actually, which is a very short question, and it's if you have ever considered of getting a robot dog yourself.
I have. I would love to get a robot. I have a biological dog who requires a lot of my time. So when his life is over, then perhaps I'll think about getting a robotic dog.
Thank you. I was just thinking, but it's only a short comment. There's this work by Hito Steyer, no, which she has shown in at sculpture project in Münster, no, which is actually a video on humanoid robotics and their failures. No, it's kind of the abuses they have to go through in the labs. No, so it's their these movements of falling, and it's kind of the opposite. But maybe it would be interesting for you in this context. Well, so I have more questions in the chat. The objective. Yeah, I have another question, which is a kind of a huge question, so maybe we can come to this in the end. It's thanks for the thought-provoking symposium and all the interesting talks. And it's a question for both panelists. And he writes, or she writes, I would be interested in your notion of technology as you understand it as something other or more than as technical artifacts. Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on your understanding of technology? It's a broad question, but maybe you have a short answer?
Well, I don't know how short my answer is, but I do have an answer. So yes, maybe we think of technology as something like the robot dogs, and in that case, it seems very much like it's exterior to the human. But actually, we ought not to think about technology as involving kind of advanced computation. We ought to think about technology as forming axe blades by flint knapping, or we ought to think about technology as the techniques used to domesticate and contain fire or generate fire on demand. And if we think about technology as alterations of the environment, that begins almost as soon as the human species begins. So there's a lot of evidence that I won't have time to go into here that the biological form of humans evolved in conjunction with technical artifacts. And again, here I'm not thinking anything about robots, but technical artifacts like stone axes, technical artifacts like spears, technical artifacts like flints, and the necessity to sequentially assemble the parts for something like a stone axe, which has the handle, which has the bindings, which has the stone itself. That is a complex procedure, and some paleoanthropologists have suggested that that was bound up with the development of speech syntax, that the same part of the brain that controls the procedures to fabricate a complex object like a stone axe was evolving, growing, and developing at the same time as human language. Bipedalism is another example of how the human form developed in conjunction with technology. Bipedalism was given a great adaptive advantage because it enabled someone to transport and manipulate tools while in motion. So if you were going around on all fours, there's no way that you could hold something and carry it out to another location or to use it en route. So bipedalism and all the complex physiological changes associated with that evolved with the development of tools. The more useful the tools, the more useful bipedalism was. The more useful bipedalism was, the more it facilitated the development of tools. So at a very early stage, the human species was already engaged in a coevolution with technical objects, and that's continued into the present, I was trying to indicate at the last part of my talk. So in that sense, technology is not external to the human body. Technology is responsible for the modern form of the human body, the kind of complex interactions, dynamical interactions that we have with our technologies is why we are the way we are, both in terms of our consciousness, in terms of our physical bodies, in terms of our neural architectures and so forth.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine. And I think this was a beautiful finishing line as we are already running out of time. And so I would really very much like to thank you both for your great talks and this very interesting discussion. And I think I will now hand over the microphone again to Patricia, and she will make a last intervention. So thank you very, very much, and I very much enjoyed sharing your panel.
And thank you.
Thank you.
I would again thank everybody who contributed to tonight, and I think I can speak for everyone that we can all draw a lot from these so dense contributions and impressions. And a warm thanks especially to Catherine Hayes and Josef Bala for your fascinating contributions, and to you, Maria Müller, for your accurate and inspiring moderation. And I'm very grateful to all of you for having been with us, for your precious contributions, questions, and discussions. And yeah, we're really sorry that we couldn't bring it all the very interesting questions from the chat, and hope you will forgive us for that. So in this course, I would like to promote the online lecture by Mercedes Bunz on the culture of artificial intelligence, and it will take place next Wednesday, January 27, and is the final event of our collaboration with Ursula Ströbeler and the Study Center for Modern and Contemporary Art at the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte in Munich. So if you're interested feel free to check the Zentralinstitut's website for more information. And hereby, I say goodbye and good night, and I hope that we will soon reunite with our future bodies and minds. So I hand over the last word to my colleague, Patricia Danda.
Thank you very much, Franziska. And I just want to briefly join you in thanking everyone who participated in these last 3 days with amazing contributions that have by far exceeded our expectations and have really blown our mind. And I guess we'll continue to think a lot about what has been said and what has been discussed in these last 3 days. And in that sense, I'm more than delighted that we really could have this symposium and bring everyone together despite this very bizarre moment that we find ourselves in. So I want to send a big shout out to Manuela Ammer, Marie-Louise Angerer, Joe Aplin, Josef Bahler, Louis Chude-Soki, Marta Jawanska, Anne Catherine Hales, Alex Kitnick, Antje Krause-Wahl, Namiko Kunimoto, Megan Luke, Maria Muhle, Ursula Ströbele, Janine Tang, and Anne Wagner. What an incredible lineup of people, what an incredible lineup of bright minds that help us shape what is going to become an exhibition at the Museum Brandhorst next year. And I'm really grateful that we could do this in collaboration with you, Ursula, and the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte, who's been a partner in our academic programs for a few years now, and we're really happy to continue this conversation. And then, of course, Iris Foundation and PIN, Freunde der Pinakothek der Moderne, have been supporting all this. Otherwise, we would not have had the possibilities to realize everything on this beautiful scale. And last but not least, I guess for everyone out there, things might look easy or not so easy from time to time. We've had a few technical interruptions, but overall, everything went really, really smooth and well. And I just want to remind you that we have half a football team working behind the scenes for us. And I want to thank Nina Jelic and Andrea Schick from our events department, who've really taken so well care of everyone involved in this. And then Anna Woll, Marina Ebenherr, and Lena Tilk, who provided us on the communication side with all the input that reached us from the outside. And of course, Tobi Klose, Florian Wolf, and Volker Wiedemann for the technical side of all this. And yeah, of course, last but not least, my fabulous colleague, Franziska Lienhardt, who has really been the driving force behind the symposium. And it was such a delight and pleasure to craft the lineup of speakers and the themes for the panels together with you. So it's really a huge privilege to have been doing that together. And yeah, this said, I mean, we did all this in view of an upcoming exhibition, which is called Future Bodies from a Recent Past, Sculpture, Technology, and the Body since the 1950s. I guess by now you know the title by heart, even if it's long. And we really hope to see you in physical form, if traveling allows us, by May 2022 here at the Museum Brandhorst. It would be an immense pleasure to welcome you all and see whether any of the discussions that we've been leading in the last days really found a forum that you find interesting and worth debating with us in the exhibition. So yeah, a warm thank you. Thanks a lot for the energy, for the input, for all that you've brought to the symposium. It was a really huge gift for us. And yeah, we look forward to what's to come. Thanks.